Today I'd like to talk a little bit about 3D and parallax that you can do in Moho. Most people call the 3D that you can do in Moho 2.5D because it's mostly, that's not entirely correct, but it's mostly putting 2D objects, flat objects, in a 3D space. That's why they call it 2.5D. However, Moho can also import real 3D objects and render them as 3D object in the 2D space, but that's a very rare case, and I've only seen very few samples where this actually is done, because usually the rendering of Moho of a 3D object as a cartoon rendering isn't that great, so usually you don't really want to use that part. Most people just use the 3D as a 2.5D, putting different layers in a 3D space. So then when you move the camera and the objects are different in different distances from the camera, you get this nice parallax scrolling. Okay, let me show you how you can do that very easily, very simply. Okay, this is one background I'm going to use in Fair Game, my new series. One thing I want to point out, the idea with Fair Game is that I make very short episodes, that I make it a kind of a low effort project so that I can churn out a full season within a year. A full season meaning like 12 episodes of about 4 to 5 minutes. The pilot will be a bit longer, but apart from that, all very short episodes. Low effort, minimal, the backgrounds have to stay simple as possible. And also the setup, I'm not going to go crazy about 3D and whatever. I just make it so that it just looks okay and is usable and fine. Okay, here is my background of this hunting lodge, and you see there's a lot of layers. It's mostly, you have the sky layer here, that's the background here, you can see that gradation. There are some mountains which are just flat shapes, which give this kind of shade of backdrop mountains. Then the swamp base is basically only just a green swamp water. And the background has a lot of, again, only silhouettes of these trees here, as you can see. Then I have a whole folder with a midground, because this is several layers which actually belong together, are definitely in the same space in 3D. This is the whole lodge. A little bit of a hill in the foreground to cover part of the base here of the stair. Then there's the lodge itself. As you can see, there's the bog water, which is basically just those little highlights. And why I have this in a separate layer is very simple, because with those I will be using, in vectors I use these noisy outlines. That means if you actually render this, you will see, maybe you can see this when I just pull it, that it's slightly moving, so it's got this noisy outline, so it looks like it's water that's just wobbling a bit. I used this in Shady Woods as well, if you might remember the scene in the well with the water at the bottom of the well. It's the same. Noise outlines is quite useful for that. It's not very smooth, because you have to set the frame rate, and if you set the frame rate to render at every frame, it'll be wiggling very fast. So if you want it to wiggle slower, you actually have to just animate on less frames. So you animate on the 2s or the 4s, and then it gets less smooth. But I think otherwise, if you'd have to do it manually, it's just so much work, and I think the noisy frames really does the job there. Okay, further, that's that. Then there is the midground, which is basically just that kind of island, that little piece of land that thing sits on with a tree and the big mushroom here. And then the front stuff is basically just this whole foreground here. Now, okay, I'm going to split the screen here. Moho has this multi-split way of, like in 3D programs, where you can see different views in everything. So link to the left side, I see the normal editing view. To the right side, I can use this icon here. Pan tilt, not pan tilt camera, which one is it? Where is the thing? Ah, this one, sorry, 9. I just remember the key shortcut, so it's 9, I just remember 9. It's the orbit cursor. With the orbit cursor, I can just orbit around this thing, and as you can see, everything's flat. So if I just move the z-axis here, I just move this further close to the camera, it's like, oh great, it's going to be 3D-ish, but the problem is it also becomes larger, And I don't want this to be larger, I just want this to be closer to the camera, right? So that's a bad idea. Now Moho has a really, really great little tool, and the cool thing is here, Shift plus Alt to move in Z and maintain visual size, and that is the cool function. So you can basically set up your whole background. You have a drawn image, hand drawn, You want to trace it in Moho. You set up your layers for front and midground and background, make your layers, you trace everything exactly the way you want it in the size you want it. And now you're at the point where you say, okay, I put this in 3D space, but I do not want to change the actual size of the objects, even if they come closer to the camera. Then you just say Alt, Shift, and don't be surprised if this thing now gets larger while you're dragging. If I dragging, and this is just to help you, to tell you, oh, this goes back or it goes forward, yeah? Because the moment you let go, so let's say I move this thing closer to the camera and I let go, it snaps back to the size it was. I do this again, okay? Just an extreme case here, boom, same size, and you think nothing happened. But if you look at the right side, you can see it moved forward to the camera. Yeah, this is too much for. It's just an extreme example here. Normally you wouldn't move it that much to the front, because then the parallax gets too extreme. But just to illustrate the point, if I now take the camera and do a side, this side dolly, you can see you get a nice parallax. This is completely over the top, so it feels like this island is way too far from the lodge. So you don't really want to do that. So let's just undo this. And just do it a bit more subtly, just a little bit forward, maybe. Something went wrong now. Yeah, now it snapped back. Okay, this should maybe do the trick. Yeah, I would stick with something like this, where you have this subtle parallax. It should even, I would maybe even go with a bit less, and you can always go back the same way. So if you feel like, oh, I went too much to the camera, you just again Option, Shift, and you move here, and then you can do your kind of tweaking. So I think, yeah, this very subtle. Let me just deselect it. So this subtle parallax here, I think, is enough to feel natural. Because as soon as I start moving the rest, you get a bit more parallax going on in the background. And that should be enough to really make it feel like, oh yeah, okay, this is like a 3D space. And so you can do the rest for all the other objects. So the whole midground, as I said, stays at where it is, basically. This background moves back a bit, and I always want to have the this orbit view, so I have a rough idea of how far back I'm going, so it's not getting too crazy. Yeah, maybe a bit more. I think that's enough, and you can always double check, you know, do a quick test with a camera dolly and feel like could be almost too much. It feels like almost it's a bit too far away, because this is supposedly very close by, right? So go back to the background here and move it a bit closer. Sometimes it's just buggy. And just see again. Yeah, it's still too much for my taste, honestly. I would go more subtle, actually. Background. Let's see. Yeah, I think this feels right. This feels right. But as you can see, the moon, that planet is still moving, and the mountains are stuck to the background. And you might have already noticed that if you zoom in here, this is kind of lifted off, so you have to adjust the position of the swamp base. So I would just go up a bit with that one, just to make sure that this stuff is actually still in the swamp. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's this. This is one example of what you can do with the 2.5D stuff. Now, in many cases like this one, I actually do not do 3D, because it's just going to be a bit of a zoom in. And at that distance, if you have like buildings and stuff, 3D is not going to do much for you unless you have a really big dolly shot. These establishing shots, you would normally just zoom in a bit at the beginning, and then you cut to the interior of the building, you know, oh, that's where we are now. So that if you look at the only 3D I have here is actually the sky and this backdrop here of these shadows here, and the rest is all just flat, completely flat. That means if I now just do a camera dolly, you only get the sky and the buildings at the back, the rest is just fixed, right? This is another shot where I did no 3D whatsoever. I hope so, I hope I'm not lying. Yeah, it's totally flat, only the sky's the limit. The rest is totally flat, because it's one of these things where I'm not going to dolly here at all, you know. It's just I'll probably have people walking in the streets, towards the, and then you have probably some announcement or advertisement playing in. That's why I just made this green, so I can easily just do a screen replacement. I don't have to do, I'm not going to do this in Moho. I've just done, probably if I show an advertisement or an announcement, I just make a flat, normal screen size thing of that, and then in Final Cut Pro we'll do a screen replacement. So that's very, very simple. So no 3D here, it just looks 3D because it's perspective. Yeah. I have a back wall, and now I want to make a side wall which is at a 90-degree angle, right? So if you just take this and copy, say, let's just call this back wall, oops, 2 L's please, and I make a copy and call this side wall, and you could say, yeah, just turn it 90 degrees, right? No problem, right? Boom, 90 degrees. There you go. Yeah, just move it over, and then you already notice, like, oh, this is, why does this not fit? Because what you actually did here is you turned it 90 degrees, but the turning of the wall actually happens in the center of the wall. That's how this works. So if you, let's just undo this. If you want to do this proper, there's several ways of doing this. The easiest way is probably, you can see this cross here. You can move this. This is the anchor point. Yeah? You would move, for example, the anchor point all to the left. You zoom in as much as you can, move it somewhere here, all to the left. Okay, just make sure it's exactly on the line. Okay, now if you do a 90-degree turning, that's in the wrong direction. I have to say minus 90 to go towards us. Now it lines up perfectly because you rotated the layer around this anchor point, which was exactly on the edge of the wall, right? So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. Generally, aligning stuff afterwards is awkward because that's the big shortcoming of Moho. Moho only has this orbit view, which is in perspective and very often in an extreme perspective. So you can never precisely place any point anywhere in 3D space, because if it lines up here, you never know if it's just it lines up because perspective is right and you look at it from a different angle and everything's off. In a proper 3D app, you usually have a top view and a right view, and you think, oh, I've got a right view, that's great, so just going to zoom in here, I'm going to, no, because the problem is that these views usually show perspective in Moho, and that's actually a problem. So that shows how half-baked the 3D is. In a proper 3D program, the top view, the side view, you should be able to see that flat, no perspective. So you can perfectly line up points, and then you can double check in the perspective if everything looks right? So you can, there is no way to have any kind of grid that makes any sense in this 3D space to line up points perfectly. So what you have to do in every case, if you want anything to line up perfectly, is basically make sure it lines up in 2D space and then rotate it in 3D space, so it lines up, as I did with this rectangle. So say you want to have a roof here. I'm just going to copy this back wall. I got the same back wall, and you would want this to be exactly the same height as it is the width, so then it'll fit the rest of the room once you flip it over. But the problem is really here that you only have scales here. You know, I mean, the whole, it's from the center, and it's just awkward. So there's no numerically really good way of positioning this stuff really precisely. You have coordinates, but then you have to go manually place your origin somewhere here, which is never precise. You know, it's never going to be precise, no matter how much you zoom in. And then you just have to hope and pray that it's close enough that it'll line up. But eventually you will get gaps, you will have stuff. So what you end up doing very often, if I want to have a roof on this, what I would do is actually, I'm going to make a roof that's just way bigger. Because if you're in a room, you never see it outside the room. So it doesn't really matter if the roof is much bigger than the room, because you have the walls that kind of limit the room, and anything that's on top of it and it's bigger doesn't matter. It's a roof. It's going to close it. They will have no gaps whatsoever. Great. And then you can just flip this thing 90 degrees. This time I think it's the X, right? Yeah. You're going to move it a bit closer to you, so you're going to move it in the Z-axis towards you, wherever, so it then kind of closes the thing. And now you've got your room, you know, moving with the camera a bit. And if you render this, it's a perfect roof. It'll always close the gap. It's fine. I have to work with these workarounds because it's almost impossible to line up things perfectly in most cases. Another thing which I found is really awkward. You might have noticed this here. Can you see the line here becoming thicker towards the camera because of the perspective? But it's kind of broken because although the line becomes a bit thicker towards the camera from a perspective, it's somehow the back line here, the vertical line, is thinner than the thinnest part of the line, starting from the same place as the back line. And the front line also is not as thick as the thickest part of this perspective line. So that's really broken, doesn't really work. So what I do in this case is basically I just say scale compensation, screw it. Sorry, that's for the sidewall. Screw scale compensation. I'm just going to have the same line width, line thickness, no matter what. And then, as I said, I always use this background line width and tweak all the lines. So all the line widths will be the same for the background then, in that case. For characters, you want to have compensation because if you make them really small and zoom out, or if you put them further away, you want them to be a bit with thinner lines. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very weird. You just look like a black blob because the lines might be thicker than the whole character is in size. But for this kind of stuff, especially if you do 3D, you might want to switch off the scale compensation. Otherwise, you will have rendering issues with line thicknesses and what else. And this just looks fine. It's all the same width. If I once again switch that on again, you'll have some really weird. It renders well, it renders nicely, but I found lots of issues as soon as you start layering stuff and touching stuff. It goes wacky all over the place. Already you can see the roof here. You don't want to go there. So I personally think for backgrounds where you don't really need this, you just make it all the same width. That is my tip for that. And I just want to show you how this is set up. So if I move the camera around here, you can see, oh, this is a bit heavy now because basically I'm recording the camera. I'm capturing my screen at the same time on the same machine, and I have to render this stuff. So it's not really super smooth. It seems janky, not very smooth, but if you don't capture two full HD streams at the same time, this is butter smooth. Anyway, so this is this 3D thing, and it's yeah, it should work for most scenes. I think you can go closer into the thing. This rendering bug is just a rendering bug. If I actually render this out, you can see the carpet looks just fine. So Moho has its quirks sometimes with 3D stuff. See again, it's fixed again. So how did I do this? So this is kind of the problem with Moho is that if you use this perspective view, it only has actually this, what is this thing called again? Orbit view. And the orbit view, for some reason, if you go to certain angles, the perspective becomes super, if you zoom in sometimes, the perspective can become super extreme and super awkward sometimes. The other thing that's sometimes puzzling a bit with and after a while it gets so messy that you just want to reset the view and go back to orbit view again, and then it gets reset somehow. So it's a bit buggy. One thing that is confusing with the orbit view is basically that the layering of objects, as you can see here, is not by default not based on the actual 3D position. So it means that if I have an object 3D from the 3D perspective in front of another object, it doesn't necessarily get rendered in front of it if the layer order is different. So basically Moho would say I render all the objects according to the layer order. So whatever is topmost will be frontmost, regardless of where in the 3D space it sits. You can change that. There's a setting for that. But I would not recommend to have it automatically change the layer order according to the 3D position, because say I want the emperor sit on the throne. Maybe one of his arms hanging over the armrest. Now you can't use 3D layer ordering for that, because what you have to do is you have probably a copy or an instance of the Emperor on top of the armrest, but you hide everything except for the elbow or the arm that has to be on top of it, and the rest has to be behind. And then you have the Emperor behind the armrest. And I have the armrest front. If I put that in front of the Kaiser, for example, yeah, and I take the guy and would say I sit him down here, and he's got his arm should be, this is just really ad hoc, so it's not going to look good. I'm not going to fix the hand either. I just want him to be, say he's just down here, chilling, okay. And now I want his arm to be on the armrest. Right now it's behind it, right? Doesn't look right. What would I do in this case? Yeah, what I would do is I just have an instance of him. He's now in front of it, and I hide everything except for the arm. So lower arm, so let's just hide everything. No, let's just hide everything. He's got a lot of layers. Yeah, and I want the lower arm F. Yep, the upper arm F. Now I need to have the shoulder up there as well. The elbow, of course, also has to be in front. Yeah, and probably the hand. Where's the hand? Talk to the hand. Yeah, and move the hand on top of lower arm F. Okay, so now this is to show the principle. So again, so you'd have this arm here, something like that. Anyway, yeah, there we go. So now you have the Kaiser sitting on the throne. I would still have to fix this here, by the way, this tail thing, just still looking here. I would have him sitting on the throne, and parts in front of the armrest and parts not, right? If I switch on the layer ordering based on 3D placement, they would all be on the same level anyway. That would be a mess. And then I would have to move the front part of the Kaiser a bit closer to the camera, but that means then you get the it will be a little bit bigger, and then nothing will line up. Those, you know, the elbow and the lines or something will not line up anymore. It's a mess. So you don't really want to do this kind of layering based on 3D placement, but rather on layer placement. And the reason the whole room is in a folder is because for a folder you can tell Moho to allow enable animated layer order. That means whenever in the timeline I start reordering things and change layers, if somebody has to move in front of something, say for example he walks down the stairs in front of a pillar, maybe he walks behind the pillar somewhere, and then now he's behind the pillar, and if you want to down here, I don't know, he walks in front of the pillar. I don't even know which pillar it is. Is it this one? Yeah. And I mean the size is idiotic anyway, but if he moves like this and he goes in front of the pillar, see, you have this layer order change here that you can see. So that's one thing that's important. If you do any kind of 3D, you definitely want to have this enabled. You want to have all the objects in that room within a folder, so you can enable it for that folder. You have to be aware that anything that is in a subfolder, you cannot, in the timeline, once you're in the timeline, you cannot move anything out of a subfolder into an upper layer. That's not possible. So whatever you might want to move back and forth in front or behind each other would have to be directly on that layer where you enabled the layer ordering. Super important. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. It's a bit of a limitation, but if you plan your scene and your background accordingly, should normally work just fine. These trophies here also are just fake 3D-ish. So as you can see, they're just flat, plain, sitting here. And what I had to do, though, that was a bit tricky when I set this up. I just had to make sure that from a placement point of view, if you look at the wall, that they're kind of sitting exactly on top of the wall, or just going a little bit into it. If they're too far away from the wall and you have any kind of 3D movement, you see they're floating. They feel off. And it's never going to be perfect because, again, of course, according to this, only the left edge is actually touching the wall and the rest is just away from that. It's a fake perspective, you know. And if I would say I'd rotate the camera here, yeah, do a camera swipe, a real camera swipe, stuff starts to look really, really weird. You know, you can see here it feels like a flat carton, paper carton thing that's just sticking out the wall, and it has no depth. You can see that. So you don't really want to do swipes like that. A little bit maybe, yeah. You can go at a tiny bit of an angle like this, a little bit like this, but generally I'd say don't do this. Rather do dollies sideways and do a little bit of a Z-axis stuff. That should work fine. Everything else, don't. Another thing is, of course, if I do dolly and if I do swipes, the roof will completely fall apart because this roof is not 3D. It's not at all 3D. So what I've done is like the whole idea is that there is kind of a hole in the ceiling, and then you have this roof thing on top. And what it is in reality is actually I have a hole in the ceiling. That is right. And behind I have this flat, huge. It's just, as you can see, it's just flat. It's a flat, huge thing that gives you the illusion of an arched roof, but it isn't. It's just flat. But it's so huge that if you look through that hole in the ceiling, you know, you just think like, oh yeah, that's kind of a. You can already see here, like with the perspective, that it doesn't work. That's wrong. I mean, that part should move the same way as the hole. It's a rectangle, but I'm never going to do this kind of camera work much anyway in this shot. All I'm going to do is maybe, whoops, maybe a tiny, not really much. So then, you know, again, I'm not going to do camera swipes. So for the most part, if you have something like this, you don't even see the top part much. You will not notice it, and you will not be bothered by it. These are the limitations. Yeah, so these are sticked out. And the trophies at the back, of course, are just flat on the wall. Same level as the back wall. So there's the back window, the throne, the whole thing here is just one flat thing. You might wonder about the steps, what happens with the steps. So initially, all those steps were flat shapes. Let me just do this for a second. So these were just flat shapes, and the frontmost steps were lower, and every step on top of it was actually just a flat shape that was higher. The reason for this is if they were all the same height and I just moved them up, you would see the gaps between the flat shapes floating mid-air, and you don't want that. So this just looked mostly, I first thought like, oh, this looks pretty much like a step. Yeah, that's fine. If like a stair, that's fine. It's going to work. And, oh, there's one more, sorry. But if you go into this view here, there were just a few things. It just, yeah, if you go a little bit from the side, it just has no volume. There's no perspective to it. So I eventually thought like, it might work for the front view, but as soon as I go into the side view, how the hell am I going to do this, right? Without any kind of actual 3D body there. Because that perspective is difficult. And as soon as you move the camera even the slightest bit, you know, the perspective is going to move radically, massively. And if you render this out, actually it doesn't look that bad. And so having these, I still have to fix this a bit because the shape is kind of weird. I don't know why this happens. I figured, yeah, it has to be 3D or nothing. Or I can just forget the whole side view entirely. So what I did was, might want to just go revert, so reload the previous thing, and I used this extrude function which it has. So you just have this rectangular shape, and you just tell, I just tell the object to extrude, and I didn't use silhouettes materials creases because it seems to be a bug. I haven't used this forever. And it turns out that when you do the extrude and use the outlines from that extrude command, you just get weird. It almost looks like a mesh, but not. So it's kind of, you see the inner angles and lines inside the object to a degree, and I have no idea how to fix it. And it always looked wrong. And so I said, forget it, I'm not going to do this. But instead, I just told it to have an outline, a 1 pixel outline, which you only can see once you render the. So it's not going to show in the real-time preview, it's just going to look kind of weirdish flat. But if you render it, you actually get an outline. Doesn't look perfect, is a bit weird, but it mostly worked. And I got a few more other issues because basically every one of these shapes is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4 shapes. That is the actual stair, the long horizontal stair, a rectangle with a yellow side band of this carpet, the red part of the carpet and the other part of the carpet, and I had to. It was somewhere hidden. Yeah, I think the thickness. That's it exactly. Yeah. So if you select a shape here, there is this thickness value, and I think it's the 3D thickness or some whatever. And if you don't do that, because they're all on the same plane, even if in the layer or in the shape order within the layer, the shape is on top of the other, you sometimes get render issues. For some reason, Moho just doesn't get it that this orange thing always has to be rendered on top of the brownish beige stair. I just had problems. It didn't really work well. So when I set the thickness of this layer to be a little bit thicker than the stair, somehow it figured, okay, it's more up there, so it is always in front, and then it worked. As a downside, you get these kind of weird little bumps because it's supposedly thicker. So it's like this bump mapping kind of thing that's happening here. It's not so bad because it is thicker. I mean, it's a carpet on top of the stair, so I think it's mostly okay. But as you have seen in the side view, when you render it, you get, because it's thicker, you get these weird bumps, which are a bit too much. So I probably have to tweak the thickness of these colors to be just a tiny bit thicker, so it doesn't really show up in the render. It just looks like a flat stair-ish, because right now it's just a bit odd. It's a bit weird. I'm not entirely happy with this. Anyway, so these are some workarounds you have to deal with, because Moho, I think the 3D at this point is very much an afterthought, because that was introduced when the previous owner of Moho, Smith Micro, was developing it, and they never went anywhere with it much, and ever since Lost Marble took over, they have never touched the 3D functionality at all, as far as I recall. I don't think they've added anything or improved anything, and so it's just in the kind of half-baked state it's been in. But you can still use it to a certain extent. It's just, I wouldn't just rely too much on it, and wouldn't think like, I don't think it's ever going to have full 3D capability. One thing that would be nice to have is if you could have universal lighting, because as you might know, for certain, you can for a layer, you can set lighting. You know, if you go into the layer here, and you can go into the shadows, you can have your layer shadow animated, you can have layer shading, I mean the shading. And it would be cool if you just had a box that would say universal lighting, and you could set maybe for the whole scene a light source, and then everything would use that light source, and you would get shading based on the light source. That would be kind of cool if you could do that, and shadows based on the light source or something. That would be kind of cool. But that's probably not going to happen. So whenever I need that kind of universal lighting, what I do is I just render out these layers as each layer as kind of a separate movie with transparency. I put it in 3D space in Apple Motion, because Apple Motion has all these particle effects and all that stuff, and can do all that crazy stuff. So that is another thing. The side view, so what I did differently there is basically I took the front view as is, and I just rotated the whole room by 90 degrees. Then, next step I did was, let me show you this here. The pillars I had before, it's still the same pillars, I just kind of turned them around by 90 degrees again, so that they face the camera again fully. I had to tweak a few things. I had to work a little bit more with the 3D placement of the back part here, because the chair, of course, as you remember, was a flat image. So I'm using several images here. If I go with where is the back window and throne? Yeah, just remove the Kaiser for a second. So what I did here is a lot of cheating and some 3D. So there is. Let's just remove this one first. So what I have here is actually, maybe just gotta show you. Okay, you can see all these parts already. So I took all these parts apart from the throne. I have the throne front, only the foot. So the throne back is really only the foot part and the backrest of the throne, which is moved a little bit in 3D space backwards. Then I just took this front part, the leg part, moved it forward. The throne armrest, actually, if you look at it in a 3D space, how this is sitting here, I think it is also important that you see actually how this thing actually is placed in 3D. So you can see actually this is bleh. Yeah, this renders really with thick lines and stuff. It's another thing. It doesn't compensate the line thickness and really goes crazy, but you can still guess the 3D placement. So you can see those pillars are turned 90 degrees towards the camera. The front back is just flat, so it looks a bit flat, so you gotta live with that. It doesn't really have real depth. The armrest is actually again, it's just a turned pseudo perspective. So the perspective you can see here is just drawn. And then there is the throne seat, which is another, as you can see, it's just a flat layer that fakes depth, and it's in 3D space. It's placed between the back armrest and you can see the front armrest, which is another flat layer just at 90-degree angle put there. And they all fake 3D. And I guess if I do a bit of a dolly even, you will see very quickly that this all falls apart, but you are not going to, yes, can you see this here? Here it falls apart already. It's just completely broken, right? Okay, so it's very fake. I just made it so that for the most part, if I'm going to have a bit of a dolly here, yeah, that works, you know, that's not going to break. But as soon as you go further, here it starts to break, but it doesn't really matter, because at that point, if you see this very thin line here, you know, this is what the camera sees. So as soon as it starts to break, actually it's out of the camera view, so it doesn't really matter. Okay. Another thing I did is I turned all these trophies 90 degrees, so they are flat on the wall now. Put them on the same 3D it's not a Z-axis as the wall, and I had to redraw all these faces, of course, to be from the front. So I just moved most of the layers around a bit, copied the eyes, so I have 2 eyes now and stuff, but it's really basically just a different image than the front one. Same for this one, where I had all the front faces flat, so I had to turn them 90 degrees so they stick out of the wall, and then had to move stuff around and made a 3/4 almost side view of these guys so that it works, which mostly works. And if you look at this, because I don't think I need the front, that's the thing, I never thought I'd need the front wall here, so these are still flat. They're still here flat. I'll probably never show these trophies anyway, so I just left them as they are. It doesn't really matter, because on the side view all you ever will see is probably that, not even that pillar, I think, unless you, yeah, you might see the pillar, but I wouldn't go any closer than that because it's going to fall apart. So you might see the pillar here. You'll never see the trophies, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah, and this is how I use this 3D stuff. You can see already here some wackiness going on, by the way, as I mentioned it. This is part of the rendering that's kind of off. I guess if I would go, let me just go with the camera here, scroll over a bit. Is this going to render right? Let's see. It looks okay, but it's not perfectly lining up already. As you can see, there's a bit of a weird thing going on here. But I think for the background, and you focus on what's in the foreground, it should work. And again, I said I'm going to make this as simple as I can, with as little effort as I can. That's why I keep the backgrounds very simple. Well, there's all these trophies in there, but they are part of them. They are the central part of the whole story, so I have to have these. But for any other details, I'm not going to put a lot of tiny things in there or anything. It's just really simple throwaway stuff that doesn't have to look super great. Or I'm not trying to get any kind of prizes for the backgrounds in this series. So that is that. 3D in Moho.
All right, Eisnard, what's the vibe today? Rugged imperial grandeur, galactic apex predator, or do we go full enigmatic warlord who doesn't try too hard?
Your wardrobe consists entirely of hunting wear in various shades of arrogance.
And that, my riveted little friend, is called branding.